Welcome to the 7th lesson in WordPress widgets front to back. In this lesson, we're going to be taking a survey of the WordPress Widgets API. But before we do that, it's important to understand that one of the most exciting things about WordPress is its support for plugins. And there are two types of plugins. There are general plugins, and then there are widgets. Now, technically, widgets are a type of plugin. However, they have their own API. That is to say that if you're writing a plugin for WordPress and you're writing a widget, then you would use one API. Whereas if you're writing a general plugin, you would use a completely separate API. Second, the WordPress Widgets API uses object-oriented programming. That means that all functions are encapsulated within a class definition. And although object-oriented programming is outside the scope of this course, I'm going to try to make this as easy as possible. To do this, point your browser to codex.wordpress.org/widgets_API. When you land on this page, you'll notice that there is a variety of information. There are function references, sidebar information, an example widget, and so on. The thing that we're most concerned about, however, is the point on developing plugins. If you look in the contents on the right-hand side of the page, you'll notice that for number 4, there is developing widgets. If you click on that, it will take you down to the developing widgets section, which includes a few sentences and then the default usage or the basic class definition. And I'll be covering this in detail momentarily. The thing that I want you to take away from this is that there is a class definition and there are 4 functions. And we'll be talking about each of these in more detail in just a minute. The first thing to understand is that everything that happens in a widget happens within the context of a class. That means that before we do anything else, we need to provide a class. And for the purpose of this screencast, we're going to define a class called myWidget, and it extends WP_widget. Now again, this is outside the scope of this course. However, this simply says that our class, which we've named myWidget, will inherit some functionality from WordPress's WP_widget class. Next, we need to tell WordPress about our widget. To do this, we'll hook into the widgets init action. Specifically, outside of the scope of the class, and we'll be reviewing this more in detail in the next lesson, we add an action to the widgets_init, and then we create an anonymous function, which is a feature of PHP, and we make a call to register_widget and then the name of our widget. So here we'll say my widget. Now, let's review the 4 functions that are required for every WordPress widget. First, we have the constructor. Generally speaking, the constructor is responsible for initializing the widget and initializing any dependencies, localization, and so on. This means that this function is required to set up anything and everything related to this widget. It's also where we would import JavaScript, style sheet, and any other dependencies that the plugin may need. The second function that we need is the form function. The form function takes in a single argument. Here, it's defined as instance. This function is responsible for rendering the widget's form in the administrative dashboard. So anytime that you go to make a change to a widget in the dashboard of WordPress, you're interacting with this function. The instance that's passed into this function refers to the current instance of this widget. Because you can have multiple widgets of the same type, that is, you could have 3 different sidebars, for example, WordPress needs to be able to uniquely identify which instance of that widget you're working with, and that's what this argument is for. The next function that we'll be working with is the update function. The update function is fired whenever the user clicks on the save button in their widget. This function will be responsible for updating the old values that exist in the database with what's been specified in the administrative dashboard, and if the values don't exist, then it will create them. For example, if you have a widget that has a single text field, and the value of that text field says hello world, and then you change it to goodbye world and then click on save, this is the function that will take the values that are in the input box and then save them to the database. Notice that this function takes in 2 arguments, the new instance and the old instance. Because we're updating the widget, it would make sense that we need to read values from the old instance and then update it with values from the new instance. The last function that we need to define is the widget function. This function is responsible for rendering the widget on the public-facing side of the site. Specifically, it is what the users will see when they come to your blog. It takes in 2 arguments. The first is the arguments array, and the second is the instance. The arguments array includes anything such as class names that may be applied to the markup or things like that. We'll look at this in more detail when we get into actually writing code. The second argument is the instance, and just like with our form function, this is also telling WordPress which instance it's working with when this function is called. So once again, if you're rendering one of 3 widgets of the same type, instance will refer to the specific one that you're working with. And because each one can have different values, this allows you to retrieve those unique values. As I said, this is going to be a short screencast. However, I think it's important to survey the API with which we'll be working so that we're able to understand where we're headed or what we're working with in the next couple of screencasts. In the next screencast, we're going to begin stubbing out our plugin. We're going to create a header definition that will allow our plugin to show up in the WordPress dashboard. After that, we're going to get into actually writing some code and giving some function to our WordPress widget. I'm ready to get started writing some code, and I hope you are too. I'll see you in the next episode.